Hello everyone. Welcome to probably the last video that I'm going to do discussing the essay. So in the first one we talked about what a primary source is and choosing one for the assignment. Most of you have chosen primary sources for this assignment. And in the last one we talked about plagiarism and the plagiarism assignment. Uh, which most of you were able to complete. I will say that if you were not able to complete the plagiarism quiz, you should have gotten a screen at some point after taking it that said that you didn't get the 9 out of 10, but if you got a majority of them correct, if you want to take a screenshot of the screen that says you have a majority of the questions correct and upload that to the assignment page, which is still available, then I will give you partial credit for that on the plagiarism assignment. They do try to trick you on that assignment somewhat, and so my advice is to go through that slowly and carefully, comparing the source to the student's writing sample, almost word by word, to try and spot the attempts at plagiarism, because some of them are sort of craftily hidden within the wider student source. So if you will grab a screenshot, if you just are unable to get the 9 out of 10 that they require to get the certificate, if you'll grab a screenshot of the screen that says you got a majority of the questions correct, then I will give you partial credit for that. So this last video is going to focus on actually writing the assignment, the essay assignment itself. So if you go on the home page here, there's a button that says Signature Assign. If you click on that, that takes you to the instructions for writing this assignment. Now this assignment is a primary source analysis. So the intention here is that you take that primary source that you chose in the first assignment, and we break that source down and analyze it for its historical significance. Now, I've given you some fairly precise directions for how you would go about analyzing that primary source, and I want to take you through that with an example source. So these 10 questions here provide a basic outline for writing this essay. Essentially, each one of these questions is going to make up a point that you need to address within the essay itself, and all of them discussing the source, who created the source, and then what we can glean from the source itself as well. So we're going to kind of go through this briefly. So the source that I've chosen to look at is this one. This is a rather famous print engraving of the Boston Massacre. It was produced by Paul Revere in the wake of this incident in Boston. And it's probably one that you've seen before. It appears in pretty much every history textbook that's ever been written that addresses the American Revolution anyways. It's in our current textbook that we use now. So you've probably run across it either in this class or previously as well. It's fairly well known. So I'll be flipping back and forth between this picture and the information about the signature assignment. So the first question here has to do with the author. Who produced your document? How much do we know about the document and the author that produced it? Because knowing something about the person that created whatever it is that you're looking at can tell us something about the document itself. Was the author a public figure? Were they a private individual? What type of person were they? What profession did they have? What kind of education did they have? All of this gives us some information about the source. So if we look at our print that I'm using, I said that the print was created by Paul Revere. Paul Revere is a rather famous American revolutionary. He was a silversmith, by trade, but he also did printing and engraving and things like that, as you can see here. And he was definitely on the side of the patriots in the Revolution. When we think about Paul Revere. And so that can tell us something about him. He's definitely a political individual in this case, and that print is not intended as a private thing. It was for publication. And that brings us into the second question here. Who was the intended audience for the document you're looking at? So, depending on what you've chosen, for the example here, this print was part of a publication. It was widely distributed. So the audience is essentially the people of Boston and beyond within the colonies. It's a public document. Now, some of you may have chosen diaries or letters or things like that. Those are not necessarily public documents. And depending on who the intended reader is, the author may write things more clearly or less clearly. So, for example, I had a student one time choose a letter that Abraham Lincoln wrote to his general at the time, George McClellan, during the Civil War. Now, Lincoln didn't care much for McClellan as a general. They didn't get on. And in fact, Lincoln later sacked him for not doing what he wanted him to do as general of the Union forces. The letter that Lincoln wrote to him, though, is quite cordial. And unless you know of the history between these two men, you may not realize that that cordiality is a kind of a cover-up for how he actually feels. And you have to sort of read between the lines on this letter to glean any hint of Lincoln's true feelings towards McClellan there. And so, again, what the document is intended for tells us something about how we should look at it and how we should understand it. So that's the next point there. Point 3 talks about what is the story, what's going on in the document. So if you're looking at a letter, what are they talking about? What are they discussing? If you're looking at a diary, again, what is the story? What are they telling us about? A speech, the same sort of thing. If you've got court documents, what is the story behind this? If we look at my example source here, the story here is quite clear. You've got a group of colonists over here on the left-hand side of the screen. Sorry, that zoomed in a little bit further than I wanted it to. Over here on the left-hand side of the screen, and you've got a group of British soldiers over here on the right-hand side of the screen. If you look over here, you can see the moon up here in the corner, indicating that it's probably nighttime. This is probably intended to be sort of moonlight streaming in. There you have images of the soldiers. If you look at the captain here, he quite clearly appears to be telling the line to fire on the colonists. All of their faces look quite aggressive. This guy in particular looks like he's really enjoying opening fire on what are ultimately portrayed as rather innocent looking colonists. They're just sort of standing around. This guy looks quite terrified, like he's trying to run away. They don't appear to be doing anything. It looks as if the soldiers just opened fire on them willy-nilly for no reason, almost. And so that's the story that we have here. So when it asks for the story, I merely need you to describe what's going on in your document. What is the document telling us? Again, the next question here, why is the document written? This ties in very closely to who the intended audience is. And if you wanted to tie the answers to these two questions together in the essay, that would be totally acceptable. Because again, who the document is written for and why the document is written are very closely related. The next thing here, what type of document is it or what purpose? Again, that's tied very closely here to who the intended audience is and what the purpose of the document is. as well. So is this for a newspaper article? If it's intended for public consumption, it will have a different tenor to it than one that is only intended for private consumption. And even further, a document that's intended for private consumption but by another person, so like a letter, for example, will have a different tenor to it than a document that is wholly intended to be private, like a diary entry, which generally isn't intended for anyone to consume other than the author themselves. And so, given how you write these different types, or how you produce these different types of documents or sources, can tell us something about the type of information we glean from it, how reliable that information is. When we think about actually applying it to history, to making larger historical assumptions. The next question here is, what are the basic assumptions made by the author? And this is talking about what the author expects their audience to know. If we're looking at a diary, assumptions are not necessarily something you're looking at, because the author is likely writing it just for themselves, not for anyone else to consume. But if we're looking at a letter, there is an expectation that when you write a letter that they will know something about what you're writing about, particularly if you mention something but you don't explain it in great detail. So what kind of assumptions does the author make? Does he or she, for that matter, mention something that as you read it, you didn't know what it meant or what it referred to? And I can give you an excellent example here. So for example, if we look at this image, there is some assumption that in order to grasp the symbolism of this image, the reader would need to know something about Boston. So this is probably the most famous building in the image, and this is the State House in Boston, which you can still visit if you go to visit the city of Boston itself. But there's a central square right in front of it, and this is where most of this takes place. The building that is of particular interest, though, is this building over here. You have it labeled here, Butcher's Hall. Now, if you are at all familiar with the city of Boston in the 1770s, then you would probably be aware that Butcher's Hall is not a place that exists. The building there is not called that, and that label doesn't exist in the city of Boston. Instead, Butcher's Hall is intended as a symbol. It's no mistake that Butcher's Hall is situated right above the line of British soldiers, and therefore the name Butchers doesn't refer to the building as just a general place for the building, but it is actually intended as a label, a descriptor for the soldiers beneath it. And so that symbolism, the assumption here is that in order to catch that piece of symbolism, you would probably need to know something about Boston. In the 1770s to realize that that is out of place and that the meaning for it is likely deeper. So what kind of assumptions does the author expect their audience to know? Or what kind of information does the author assume the audience would know? The point number 7 here, can you believe this document? Is it reliable or likely? Now that's kind of a tricky question, in that I think quite often students see it as a more simple question than what it's really asking. When we think about believability or reliability when it comes to historical sources, what we're thinking about is it true? Is this an accurate portrayal of history as we know it? And really what this question is getting at is the concept of biases. How biased is the author? Now, most of the time, people produce things with a purpose, and that purpose can bias their portrayal of things as they appear. So, for instance, Shakespeare is a fantastic example. When we look at Shakespeare's history plays, um, and particularly if we look at the play about Richard III, Shakespeare is very uncomplimentary to Richard. But Shakespeare is also writing plays under Tudor monarchs. And the Tudors were the family that defeated Richard III. And so, in a lot of ways, the play Richard III is Tudor propaganda, vilifying their enemy. Um, and so, a lot of things you have to take, a lot of descriptions and actions you have to take with a grain of salt when you're thinking about the play Richard III. In this example, you have to take this, at least a little bit, with a grain of salt as well. So, when we look at the Boston Massacre, we have accounts. There was actually a trial. At least 5 of the soldiers were brought um, to trial for the actions of the Boston Massacre. And so we have a fairly accurate idea of how these events played out. The first thing is that the so-called massacre happened in the morning, during the daytime. It was in the wintertime. There was snow around on the ground, and there had been an incident just prior to this, a day or so prior to this, an incident which resulted in the death of a young boy, I think around 11 or 12. Earlier that morning, they'd had the funeral for the boy. A number of Bostonians were loitering outside the customs house, which is where the state house is, which is part of the function the state house served. Um, they were there was also a group of British soldiers loitering around in the same place. The colonists got a little rowdy. They started shouting insults at them, throwing things. They would gather up snowballs and throw snowballs. Sometimes those snowballs contained rocks, at the British soldiers, taunting them, actively taunting them. Um, kind of unexpectedly, uh, sort of out of nowhere, a shot was fired. It's unclear as to who exactly fired that first shot, but a shot was fired. A volley of shots happened afterwards. There was no clear order, it just sort of happened as a kind of knee jerk reaction. And at the end of it, 5 colonists were killed. Several others were injured, but 5 were killed. It was a scene of relative confusion. There was no order given. There was no neat line of British soldiers firing on an innocent populace. Ultimately, it was a tense situation that got out of hand. Taking that description, it's quite clear that this image doesn't portray that. You have relatively innocent colonists, none of whom seem to be wielding weapons. If anything, they're all sort of running away. They're seen as reactors to British aggression, as opposed to the other way around, which is, according to other documents, court documents, for example, that's what happened, is that the colonists were taunting the British. They were the aggressors in the situation. Here you have an organized line of British soldiers being ordered to fire by their captain, excuse me, over here. And again, that's not the description that we get from other sort of official documentation at the time. The fact that this is entitled The Bloody Massacre, perpetuated in King Street by Paul Revere, is also um, somewhat misleading as well, I guess you could say. Because, as I said, only 5 people were killed, and that doesn't quite suggest a massacre necessarily, with so little amount of damage imposed. And so ultimately, what we have here in this image is a propaganda piece. This is an effort by Paul Revere to paint a picture of this incident in a way that would make his side of the argument, the patriot side, much more sympathetic. And so you paint the British as butchers, um, and as aggressors in a situation where they simply were not those. And so when we talk about the reliability of this document, is it reliable as a source of accurate historical knowledge for what happened during the events of the Boston Massacre? No, this is not reliable. Is it reliable as a source that tells us about the patriot propaganda machine during the revolution? Yes, it's an excellent example of that. And so really, reliability is dependent on what exactly we're being shown or told about in these sources. So really, it's a question of biases. And so rather than the question, can you believe this document? Perhaps you should ask, is this author biased? And is that bias apparent in this document? The last three questions all go to more wider analysis. Now that we've broken down the document itself, question number 8 asks, what can we learn about the society that produced this document? So this image, again, by Paul Revere, what can we learn about the society that this was published in? Well, we can see representation of tension in this image between the colonists and the British. We can also get a sense of how public opinion is shifting, um, or maybe we can get a sense of how Revere and those like him are trying to shift public opinion by portraying the British as brutish and evil, even through these actions, because there were a lot of Americans in 1770, which is when this happens, March 5th, 1770. There's a lot of American colonists in 1770 who, while they aren't happy with the actions of the British, are also not ready to leave Britain either. Independence is not something that everyone is keen on at this point in history. And so we can see here a real effort by Paul Revere to try and drive a wedge between the people and their king. Because while people were particularly angry at Parliament because of all the acts being passed, people weren't generally so angry at the king. And so the fact that he's titled this bloody massacre perpetrated in King Street in Boston, the need to state the name of the street, King Street, is probably not as important. People would know where this happened. But we want to link the king with it. We want to try and sever those ties. You can also see that he's written a description of what happened, at least from one point of view, and he uses phrases like savage bands with murderous rancor, like fierce barbarians grinning over the carnage, and things like that to describe the soldiers. He describes the patriots as having copious tears for each are being shed, meaning each person who was killed having copious tears shed. And so we see here a real effort to condemn the soldiers and to hold up the colonists. And see, there's really some convincing going on there. And it's in this question, as well as the first question, where your primary source, or your secondary sources, are going to come into play. Secondary sources, particularly if you are not 100% confident in your knowledge about the events surrounding the document that you're looking at, or the history or what's going on in that society during the time that that document is produced, your secondary sources can give you good access to that information. And again, on the first question up here, secondary sources will be a good place to get information about your author and how they're writing and when they're writing. The last question, or the last two questions here, what is the importance of this document to history? And then finally, what does this document mean to you? What is the importance of this to you? Why did you choose this document? My recommendation when you were choosing your primary source was to pick a topic that you enjoy and find a primary source that falls under that topic or falls within that topic. So, why did you pick the source that you picked? What does it mean to you? And what does it mean to historians? What can or why should historians use your document to learn and to write about history? So that's the basic gist of this essay. And it's going from kind of specifics to more broad. So first start out by talking about the author and then the document itself, who was intended to read it, what type of document is it, what sort of assumptions does the author make, why was it written, what is in it, what is the story going on, is it reliable, is it a reliable source for historical accuracy, or is it perhaps a little bit biased, and then what can it tell us about the society that produced this document, and how is it important to us today in history? So those are the three parts. So the last assignment is the final essay. Final essay is due December 7th, so you've got just over a couple of weeks, or just around 2 weeks to finish it. December 7th, just upload a document with the final assignment. Again, it is intended to be at least 1,000 words, which is somewhere around 4 to 5 pages, generally speaking, for 1,000 words. Kind of depending on what you use. As far as that goes, please keep in mind plagiarism when you're quoting your document, or you're quoting primary sources or secondary sources rather, and you're using those sources in your paper. Just be aware of properly citing those. In whatever format you feel most comfortable. MLA is what the assignment page says here. In history, we do normally use APA, so if you want to attempt to use APA, you're more than welcome to do so, but if you're more comfortable in MLA, that's absolutely fine as well. And so that's to be uploaded here by December 7th. You are more than welcome to upload it early if you finish it early. And so that is the assignment there. Please let me know if you have any questions or anything like that about the essay assignment. And I will speak with you later.